All right, we're back now at 7:41 with a look inside one of the country's most famous homes.
A pop icon shrouded in mystery, a sprawling estate filled with secrets. It is in this sprawling mansion on Carrollwood Drive where Michael Jackson lived his final moments, and now newly unearthed details about what the FBI really found in Michael Jackson's estate have emerged, pulling back the curtain on a man idolized by millions yet deeply misunderstood. The FBI has released more than 300 pages of formally classified documents. No, it's not a criminal bombshell, but it's not good either. What agents uncovered paints a poignant, unsettling picture of a superstar whose home was less a palace of luxury and more a time capsule of trauma. That one of the filming locations is Michael's former home, Neverland, which Access has spent quite a bit of time at over the years. Welcome to Neverland, Michael Jackson's carefully constructed world filled with memories he never had and innocence he never knew. Behind Neverland's gates, what the FBI actually looked for. Michael Jackson was one of the most famous people on the planet. It turns out he was also the target of intensive FBI scrutiny. When the FBI turned its eyes toward Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch, the world was watching. The sprawling 2,700-acre estate in Santa Barbara County wasn't just the singer's residence, it was a mythic sanctuary, an amusement park, a zoo, and to many, a psychological fortress. Neverland had long fascinated the public. It wasn't just where Jackson lived, it was how he lived that raised questions. By the early 2000s, mounting legal scrutiny and a flood of tabloid speculation had put the estate at the center of a growing storm. Allegations swirled, lawsuits were filed, and television specials dissected Jackson's life with surgical intensity. It was only a matter of time before federal authorities got involved. When they did, expectations were high. Many assumed a search would uncover something incriminating. But the reality of what the FBI found in Michael Jackson's estate told a much different story. Agents didn't raid Neverland based on a baseless rumor. Their involvement was strategic, calculated, and grounded in overlapping investigations that required federal oversight. The Bureau worked alongside local law enforcement, collecting documents, inspecting personal effects, and interviewing staff and associates. Their mandate was clear: find the truth. And they did, but it wasn't the truth the public expected. Neverland, as agents soon discovered, was no ordinary home. Every inch of the estate was designed to shield Jackson from the outside world. It wasn't a celebrity's hideaway, it was a carefully constructed dreamscape engineered to preserve fantasy over fact. The carousels, the arcade, the petting zoo, none of these features were incidental. They were deliberate attempts to rewrite the reality of Jackson's life. What the FBI found in Michael Jackson's estate wasn't criminal, but it was illuminating. Hidden among the props and memorabilia were artifacts that gave them a rare and unfiltered look into Jackson's internal world. The agents noted personal writings, childhood memorabilia, framed letters from young fans, and an overwhelming amount of material tied to themes of youth, innocence, and escape. There were no illegal materials uncovered, no smoking guns. But there was something far more complex, a pattern. The items revealed a man who hadn't just created a fantasy world, he had become dependent on it. That dependency wasn't listed as a crime, but it raised serious questions. Why had Jackson constructed an environment where reality had no place? And what did that say about the emotional forces guiding his decisions? Ultimately, what the FBI found in Jackson's estate was a map of the man's mind. It wasn't evidence of guilt, but it was evidence of struggle. And for many who read the reports and saw the photos, the conclusion was unsettling. It was clear something about this place and this man was not good. The emotional evidence, a life frozen in time. Inside Neverland, everything stopped in time. The decor was whimsical, themed around fantasy, innocence, and youth. There were Peter Pan murals adorning the walls, life-sized superhero statues guarding quiet hallways, and a full-scale train station that could rival Disneyland. But beyond the theatrical elements lay a far more sobering truth. Jackson was attempting to reconstruct a world that had been taken from him long before he ever had a chance to live in it. As federal investigators moved through the estate, cataloging every room and object, a clearer picture began to form of emotional isolation. Bedrooms weren't just sleeping quarters, they were filled with toys, remote-controlled cars, vintage action figures, and Lego sets arranged neatly on shelves. The hallways displayed framed images of cartoon characters, not awards. Dining rooms had child-sized chairs surrounding adult-sized tables. These weren't simply eccentric design choices, they were manifestations of unresolved trauma. They were extensions of the man himself. Michael Jackson spoke openly in interviews about his stolen childhood. From the age of 6, he was working under adult expectations. The Jackson 5 became a sensation, and Michael became the face of a brand before he even learned how to live like a normal kid. His father, Joseph Jackson, was widely reported as being strict, emotionally distant, and at times physically violent. And he didn't allow us to call him Daddy, and I wanted to call him Daddy so bad. He said, "I'm not Daddy." Rehearsals, studio sessions, and world tours replaced birthday parties and playgrounds. The ordinary milestones of growing up were lost in the pursuit of greatness. So when he reached a level of fame and financial independence where he could build anything he wanted, I've always believed that the real measure of celebrity success was not just how famous he becomes but what he does with that fame and fortune. Jackson didn't construct a status symbol mansion filled with luxury decor. He created Neverland, a living memory of what never was, a refuge where clocks didn't tick and adulthood never arrived. To outsiders, it may have seemed fantastical. But to those who looked closer, and to the FBI who documented it all, it became clear that Neverland was a psychological time capsule, a world where Michael Jackson tried to put his broken pieces back together. This context is key to understanding what the FBI actually found in Michael Jackson's estate. There were no illicit materials, no scandalous discoveries, but what they did find was emotional evidence, a residue of pain, loss, and longing. Jackson wasn't hiding evidence of wrongdoing, he was hiding from his past. And perhaps in that hiding, there was something deeply unsettling, a grown man living in a child's world, not because of anything criminal, but because he couldn't bear to leave it behind. This is a super soaker. I can feel it and tell. But one particular piece of evidence shocked not only those who stumbled upon it but the public too. It raised questions that Jackson was left answering for the rest of his life, and it all lay inside a collection of books. This is shocking, the collection of books that raised eyebrows. Among the most talked about items found in the estate were a collection of books that instantly raised eyebrows. They weren't hidden in plain sight, they were stored discreetly, placed in areas of the home not typically frequented by guests or the public eye. The volumes themselves weren't illegal, but they were questionable. Some included photographs of children, smiling, playing, captured in moments of pure, unfiltered innocence. The imagery in a vacuum was benign, but within the context of Jackson's life and the estate's design, they prompted serious curiosity from federal investigators, especially with ever-intense scrutiny on the kind of life he lived. There was nothing explicit, no laws were broken. The books didn't contain anything that would trigger criminal charges, but the FBI took notice because, by this point, all eyes were on Jackson, and people wanted answers. The books did nothing to prove his innocence on the face of it, but when looked at in the wider context of Neverland, a terrible picture began to emerge. These weren't bestsellers or celebrity biographies. They weren't on display for artistic admiration, they were personal. Critics were quick to jump to conclusions, implying that ownership of such materials was evidence of something darker. But what most failed to consider was the emotional narrative buried beneath those pages. These weren't trophies, they were mirrors, reflections of a fractured past. Jackson himself reportedly wrote in one of the books, "Look at the true spirit of happiness and joy in these boys' faces. This is the spirit of boyhood, a life I never had and will always dream of." That sentiment matters. It reframes the books not as suspicious but as symbolic. For Jackson, these images were less about the children and more about what the children represented: laughter, freedom, innocence, three things he never truly experienced. I don't know if I was his golden child or whatever it was. To the FBI, the collection stood out not as incriminating but as revealing. It wasn't evidence of misconduct, but it was evidence of trauma. Psychologists brought in to consult on the findings viewed the collection as consistent with Jackson's lifelong emotional patterns. He wasn't celebrating childhood from a distance, he was grieving it, attempting in the only way he knew how to reconstruct the feelings he never had. Michael's own words, I never had a childhood. Michael Jackson didn't hide his pain. He didn't bury it behind fame or disguise it with rehearsed sound bites. In interviews, he often let his guard down completely, sometimes tearfully offering the public rare glimpses into a life defined by pressure, control, and the absence of ordinary joy. I never had a childhood, he told journalist Martin Bashir in the 2003 documentary Living with Michael Jackson. My childhood was completely taken away from me. There was no Christmas. There were no birthdays. It was not a normal childhood. I always wanted to be like Peter Pan. That wasn't just a metaphor. Peter Pan became his alter ego, an identity he embraced publicly and privately. He said to me that he's Peter Pan, you know, and I feel that way too, and I guess we have the same feel about life. This longing for youth didn't just influence his art, it shaped his world. The entire Neverland estate was an extension of that desire. Bedrooms decorated with teddy bears, kitchens filled with children's cereals and snacks, an on-site movie theater equipped for sleepovers complete with bunk beds and candy dispensers. These weren't theatrical flourishes of a millionaire, they were part of a deliberate attempt to reclaim a stage of life he never got to live. And that's where the books that the FBI found slotted in. From the outside, this behavior was often misinterpreted. Michael Jackson wasn't pretending to be a child, he was mourning never having been one. As investigators sifted through his estate, they noticed it. It wasn't hidden, it was everywhere. His identity wasn't rooted in scandal, it was rooted in sadness. Jackson formed close bonds with other young celebrities like Macaulay and Kieran Culkin. To critics, those friendships seemed inappropriate. But to Jackson, they were reflections of himself. He saw in them the same pressures, the same expectations, and the same loss of normalcy. These weren't opportunistic relationships, they were efforts to connect with those who shared his experience of fame before puberty, scrutiny before adolescence, and burnout before adulthood. One of his most misunderstood statements came during the same Bashir documentary, "I've slept in a bed with many children." It ignited media chaos. But Jackson clarified his words, insisting it was entirely non-sexual. "We just talked, watched movies, ate popcorn." It was, to him, a safe space, a moment of connection, something he never had when he was the same age as the children around him. Though outsiders questioned the optics, those close to Jackson, including several families, repeatedly defended his intentions, saying that the books and the entire Neverland estate showed a man who was deeply traumatized by his past. Friends, not victims. The children who defended him amidst the swirling allegations that followed Michael Jackson throughout his later years told a different narrative, one not fueled by lawsuits or speculation, but by the voices of those who knew him personally as children. Several of Jackson's young friends, now adults, stepped forward to share a side of the story rarely highlighted in headlines. Chief among them was Macaulay Culkin, one of the most iconic child actors of the 1990s and a frequent guest at Neverland Ranch. In interview after interview, Macaulay has remained consistent and composed. "He never did anything to me. I never saw him do anything," he told Esquire in 2020. "We were friends. That's it." His statement didn't waver in tone or implication. For Macaulay, Jackson was not a figure of fear or manipulation. He was a trusted friend and a deeply empathetic adult who understood the unique weight of childhood stardom. Macaulay Culkin's brother, Kieran, now widely known for his role in Succession, also visited Neverland and spent time in Jackson's orbit. While Kieran has chosen not to speak extensively about his experiences, his brief comments in The Guardian suggest a desire to protect, not himself. But the emotional truth of what he witnessed, "It's just going to hurt someone." He said, "I can't be helpful to anyone on this." That silence, in context, says more than accusation ever could. To the Culkins and others like them, Jackson was never a predator. He was someone who offered them space to breathe, to laugh, to exist without the glare of constant expectation. At Neverland, they found something that mirrored childhood, even if it was constructed through the lens of a man still searching for his own. Jackson was attempting to protect these children in a way he never had been, whilst also reclaiming experiences he'd missed out on. They remember watching movies late into the night, riding the Ferris wheel, and making prank calls together. The sleepovers weren't surrounded by secrecy, they were filled with moments that felt, in their own way, ordinary. And that's the part that often gets lost. While allegations filled tabloid pages and dominated news cycles, the children closest to Jackson, those who spent time alone with him, who stayed in his home, who saw him unfiltered, never wavered. The FBI found no criminal materials in Jackson's estate, not during the 1993 investigation, not during the 2005 trial, not in any of the years that followed. For the friends who stood by him, the narrative was never confusing. They weren't victims, they were kids who saw a man trying to heal, and decades later, their defense hasn't cracked. But the books, the toys, the time spent with children had already swayed many people's opinion on Jackson. The world's judgment, public opinion versus legal facts. Michael Jackson's name is embedded in the foundation of pop culture. His influence on music, dance, and performance art is undeniable. But equally embedded in public consciousness is the long shadow of controversy, and what the FBI found in his estate did nothing to quieten the rumors. The years that followed were filled with speculation, culminating in a high-profile 2005 criminal trial where Jackson faced 14 charges and was acquitted on all counts. Yet for much of the public, the acquittal didn't equate to innocence. Instead, it opened the door to deeper scrutiny. For many, what was found in his estate simply wasn't normal for a grown man to possess. They couldn't see beyond the surface. To them, books filled with photos of children were evidence of wrongdoing, and they struggled to see how they could represent a man who had missed out on the life that was depicted in the images. This is where the FBI's findings matter. During their investigation, they searched Michael Jackson's estate thoroughly. They reviewed materials, seized items, and conducted interviews. What they found did not confirm the darkest assumptions. There were no illicit images, no hidden rooms concealing wrongdoing. The items that raised eyebrows were odd, yes, but not illegal. The decor, the books, the child-centric aesthetics, all pointed to a man living emotionally in the past, not someone committing crimes. Still, the court of public opinion often ignores the standards of a legal courtroom. Feelings become facts, assumptions become beliefs, and Jackson, already complicated by fame and reclusion, became a permanent fixture in one of pop culture's most polarizing debates. The divide between perception and reality couldn't be clearer. What the FBI found in Michael Jackson's estate was peculiar, emotionally revealing, and even troubling in its implications, but it was not criminal. The facts never matched the speculation, and in the end, the real story may be less about guilt or innocence and more about how the world chose to interpret a man they never truly understood. For most of the world, Neverland was a bizarre place where Jackson could get away with whatever they wanted, but the reality is it likely shielded a man from a world that could never truly understand what he'd lost. Neverland is a mirror. What the estate really reflected, Neverland was never just a home. It was a mirror reflecting the fractured psyche of a man who never had the chance to grow up. When looked at through this lens, the books of children, the toys, and the sleepovers begin to take on a new meaning. The FBI didn't just investigate a ranch in California, they stepped into a world painstakingly designed by someone desperate to freeze time. Every room, every ride, every detail whispered the same message. Michael Jackson was living in a suspended state of childhood. When the FBI catalogued the contents of Neverland, they weren't just recording physical evidence, they were stepping into the inner life of a man who, despite unimaginable wealth and global fame, was emotionally marooned. What they found wasn't criminal, but it wasn't normal either. And because of that, people were quick to judge. Books featuring children, framed photos of smiling young faces, stacks of board games, rooms filled with toys and child-sized furniture, these weren't planted for show. They were curated expressions of longing, items that, if taken out of context, could easily be misunderstood. But within the framework of Jackson's life, they painted a picture not of guilt but of grief. The books drew particular attention. Though legal, their presence raised eyebrows. They were hidden away, as if Jackson understood that he would be judged for owning them. This only fueled people's argument that they weren't innocent. But Jackson had 3 children of his own, and when asked about the books he responded, "This is the life I want for my children." He deeply understood that he had a chance to give his children something he'd never had. The joy captured in the photos within the books gave Jackson a reference point for raising his own children because he had no other framework to work from. The wallpaper, the collectibles, even the candy machines, it all told a story, one not of menace but of memory, a life reimagined through fantasy because the reality had always been too harsh. The world, obsessed with scandal, overlooked the human pain embedded in those walls. Neverland wasn't built to deceive, it was built to protect. Not from the law, but from the loneliness. And what the FBI found there, what they really uncovered, wasn't criminal evidence. It was emotional residue, a visual diary of a boy who never got to be a boy and a man still chasing that version of himself. Sadly, this version of Jackson, the one surrounded by damning rumors and items no one can fully understand, is the one that many now remember. What the FBI found in Jackson's estate may have altered his legacy. Forever, what remains? The legacy of a haunted genius. What remains after the trials, the documentaries, and the endless debates? What remains after the FBI went through every drawer, every closet, and every corner of Michael Jackson's estate? All that is left is a portrait of a haunted genius, a man who gave the world some of the most iconic music ever recorded, but whose private world was a place suspended in emotional limbo. When the FBI completed its investigation, there was no shocking contraband, no monstrous double life. Instead, they found something far more intimate and arguably far more heartbreaking. What they found was a museum of lost innocence. But due to the strange nature, many twisted Neverland and its contents into something sinister. Jackson spent the whole of his adult life trying to be the boy that never grew up, but the sad reality is he never experienced childhood. The books that the FBI found, along with all the other materials, were the only points of reference Jackson had on what it was like to be a kid. Forensic teams expected evidence. What they uncovered was something different, a decades-long attempt to reclaim what had been taken too soon. The truth is, what the FBI found in Michael Jackson's estate is not good, not because it pointed to guilt, but because it pointed to emotional devastation. The books and the toys have long been misunderstood and have now replaced his musical genius, leaving a legacy in tatters. Jackson was a man frozen at the age he was when he became famous, a man who spent millions not to indulge in vice, but to recreate a place where pain couldn't follow. He didn't get that place as a child, so he tried to build it as an adult. For the fans who hoped for vindication and for the critics who expected scandal, the truth is unsettling in a different way. The findings didn't confirm either narrative. What they did reveal was a life that defied categorization. Jackson was not the monster some imagined him to be, nor was he the flawless icon others wanted him to be. He was something more difficult, a deeply flawed, deeply wounded human being. This is shocking, not because of what was found, but because of what it says about our expectations. We wanted a clean conclusion. We got emotional complexity. We wanted guilt or innocence. We got trauma and longing. We wanted answers. We got evidence of pain. Neverland wasn't a crime scene. It was a sanctuary. And when the FBI opened its doors and catalogued what lay inside, they didn't just expose Jackson's private world, they exposed ours, our rush to judge, our fear of ambiguity, and our inability to accept that sometimes the real story isn't about crime. It's about what happens when fame replaces family and talent can't protect you from the wounds of childhood. What do you think about what the FBI found in Michael Jackson's estate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.